talking about strategic planning. I'm curious, how many of you, I mean, it's a small audience, but I'm just curious, how many of you have been making some strategic plans over the last 12 months or so, or participated in that process? One hand, right? Hi, please. All right, and how many of you have made strategic plans that have considered a scenario like this? Zero. Yeah, very likely zero. Well, that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm doing this session. And really, the two objectives for today's session is one is to highlight the shortcomings of the traditional strategic planning process, and two is to familiarize you with scenario planning. All right. And why am I a good person to tell you about this? So I've been in the gaming industry for almost 20 years, just a bit over 18 actually. And I've had the pleasure to work with some remarkable companies like Nordeus and CCP Games, together with some amazing people. I founded the Serbian Games Association about 7 years ago. About the same time, I started my own consulting business, and there we work with hundreds of clients from 30 plus countries. Also around the same time, I started investing in gaming startups and a limited partner in 2 VC funds as well. And as you can imagine, thanks to all of these experiences, I've seen hundreds of pitch decks, looked at hundreds of strategies, been to hundreds of strategic offsites. And that gives me a kind of unique perspective and ability to talk about the shortcomings of the traditional planning process. And as for the scenario planning, I actually attended a program at the Oxford University dedicated purely to scenario planning. And so my objective is that in the next 20 minutes or so, I can't transfer over everything that I learned, but at least get you curious about it, so that if you want, you can learn more about it afterwards. So, as a manager today or a leader, really most of the decisions that you're making, and really all of the big ones, have to do with the future and how well your team, your game, or your company will be performing in the future, right? And right now, based on the best information that you have available to you, whether that's reliable or not, that's questionable, but you're making decisions about how to grow your profits in the future, how to increase the market share, how to launch a new game, and so on. And really, there are countless other aspects there are countless other aspects that affect your business and how competitive you will be in the future, right? And so when you consider that, managers to some extent, they live for the future. And with that in mind, then it's only reasonable that a significant amount of time is actually dedicated to thinking how that future will be like. And this is what often does happen in the companies, right? They invest a lot of time and effort thinking and talking about the future and coming up with these strategic plans, right? However, like I said, based on my experience, these strategic plans that typically emerge at the end of this process, they tend to treat the future as an extrapolation of the present, right? A more or less, linear continuation, right? Maybe with some ups and some downs, right? And this is a problem, right? This is a problem, any plans that come up that treat the future as something that is rather predictable, well, they're not completely worthless, but they're kind of doomed to irrelevance the moment that something unforeseen happens, right? And as Mike Tyson famously said, you get punched in the mouth, right? So in this traditional, strategic planning process, there are 2 extrapolations that are taking place. And one of them is called mathematical extrapolation. And really, mathematical extrapolation is basis for most forecasting. All right? And you're all very familiar with this, the planners, the executives, when who's coming up with strategic plans, typically they would come up with what they misleadingly are calling scenarios. All right? And usually they will have 3 scenarios. All right? The best case, the worst case, and the most likely or the most realistic case, right? I think we all we all did that, right? And all of that is achieved by tweaking the variables in the model and then seeing what pops up, right? Numbers up, that's the best case scenario. Numbers down, the worst case scenario. And by variables, I mean things like daily active users, conversion rate, retention rate, cost per install, ROAS, whatever variables you might be using in your forecasting model, right? And it's very easy to do it this way, right? And at the heart of this kind of planning, a second kind of extrapolation takes place, and for a lack of better words, we can call it a mental extrapolation, right? And so all of these plans, right, and forecasts that come up, they are predicated on this notion that other than the variables, nothing else would change, right? They're treating the future in all these forecasts just based on the variables that are in the model. So what they're kind of saying with this is that, tomorrow is very much going to be like today, next month, very similar to this month, next year, pretty much like this year. And this is a problem. This is flawed thinking, and any organization that relies too much on such thinking may be facing like fatal consequences, right? Because no matter how sophisticated your forecasting model may be, by basing the view of the future and painting the future as something that is only affected by the variables in your model, you're kind of saying that nothing else is changing, right? Now, Gary Hamel, who is considered one of the most influential business thinkers of today, he said that the problem with the future is that it is different, right? And if you're unable to think differently, the future will always arrive as a surprise. So, if traditional planning and forecasting is not the best way to visualize the future, what is? It's scenario planning, right? You guessed it. So, while nobody has a crystal ball, right, and nobody can see the future, scenario planning as a methodology can help you to some extent visualize the future, or to be more precise, a range of alternative futures, right? And how basically your business landscape could look like in the future, right? Scenario planning was basically discovered or created following the Second World War by the US Air Force, and it was used for military planning. But later on, it was embraced and developed further the most by the Royal Dutch Shell Corporation. And really, with the scenario planning, instead of relying on the projections that paint the future as some basically linear continuation of the past trends and just a variation of what it is today, the scenario planning basically challenges this very idea that there is a future that is most likely. Right? And when you engage in the process of scenario planning, all you're doing really is coming up with a portfolio of future scenarios that could plausibly emerge depending on how the developments that are happening today continue to unfold over the time. Right? And so, the key benefit of this process when you engage in scenario planning is not to create predictions or to predict what is going to happen. No, the unknown obviously will always remain unknown. But rather what scenario planning does do is opens your eyes to how the future might develop in different ways. And so that today, with these insights, we can make more flexible, more thoughtful, and ultimately better decisions and better strategic plans that allow your company to deal with these uncertainties. And why is this important? Well, it's important because usually when an established business or company fails, it's typically not because they didn't predict exactly the cost of user acquisition or exact interest rate in a year from now. No. Usually when a business goes, when a company fails and goes out of business, it's because their inability to fundamentally understand how their competitive landscape will change for the worse. If a new technology was to appear, if new restrictive regulation was to be put in place, and so on. And this is where scenario planning helps. Right? So this is how the process and all the steps look like. You typically start by framing a challenge, getting information about that, identifying the relevant driving forces, and then coming up with the scenarios that could emerge depending on how these forces would impact your business landscape. And then ultimately you would generate the scenarios that helps your organization to deal with those uncertainties. Now, it's a very extensive process, takes a lot of time. We don't have time to go through each of these steps right now, but I would want to just stay a bit longer and talk about the driving forces. So typically, if you were to engage in this process, for each of your challenges, you're expected to come up with dozens, sometimes even over 100 driving forces that may be relevant, right? And typically they will be coming from these 4 areas at the top, but all 10 are relevant depending on the circumstances. And I remember, for example, when I was at Oxford when we were doing this, we had a presentation from the Chief Strategy Officer at Rolls-Royce Corporation. And they walked us through the scenario planning process they did as a company in 2015, which actually helped turn around Rolls-Royce as a business. And I remember they sharing the fact that they had come up with over 120 driving forces, but then through the process of filtering and eliminating, they narrowed it down to about 25. And the point is, with the scenario planning, that you focus on the critical extremes, that you focus on the events that are high impact, right? But yeah, all of this is very relevant, and as you can see, you can go in many, many different areas. Now, I know that probably some of you are thinking, this might seem overwhelming, US Air Force, Royal Dutch Shell Corporation, Rolls-Royce, these are all massive corporations, is this relevant at all to my studio, right? It's a very valid question. I remember when I finished the program, I reached out to several gaming CEOs, successful gaming studios, and I asked them how do they approach long-term planning. And I received very mixed responses, as one can imagine, but there was one that stood out. So the CEO, again, very successful mobile gaming studio, he said, "Nick, we don't bother with the long-term planning at all. We're only focused on the next 6 months ahead." It was very shocking to me at the time. And I actually looked up how they're doing a few months ago. They're doing even better than that. So do you need to do this in order to be successful? No. It's not a requirement, but should you be doing this? I genuinely think that it's a worthwhile investment of your time. When I just look around, the last couple of years, what's been happening in the industry and how many layoffs and closures we've had, I cannot help but think that we collectively in the industry could do a much better job of looking ahead and planning. And very often, I would hear excuses. Well, Nick, we're in a very dynamic industry, a creative industry. It doesn't make sense to look so far ahead. You never know what's going to happen. Sure, that holds, but I also disagree. Think about the games like Grand Theft Auto. Right? It takes 5 to 10 years to develop the title, and another 10 years to commercially exploit it. So Rockstar, they need to be thinking, 15 to 20 years ahead when they're starting the development of that, how it will be consumed and commercially exploited. That's a very long-term planning. Right? And generally successful businesses, they're all playing the long-term game, and that's why I think that everybody can benefit from doing this. And it doesn't have to be hard, right? Doing this process all the way in every detail can be consuming, but you don't need to, right? So I put together like 4 challenges just to show you how you can sort of frame it and make it more tangible and easy to work with, even just as a thought exercise, right? So, we're witnessing all this turbulence that are happening around us on the political scene. And I actually prepared this for another conference in London in January. And then what happened? You remember with TikTok and Marvel? This happened. It was banned because of the political conflicts. Or we all rely heavily on 1 or 2 platforms, right? Whether it's Steam, Apple, Google, and so on. What happens if, let's say, Apple comes and says, well, listen, we're not making much money out of advertising or any money at all, and it's just like, not really good for our ecosystem, for the user experience. Let's just ban it tomorrow or the next month. This could happen. These things are happening. The platforms are making decisions that impact the whole ecosystem like that. And yet, very few people are actually thinking about the consequences and what they as a studio would do if that was to happen, right? Everybody talks about US as a tier 1 market or the most important market, and if not the US, then the tier 1 markets. And they're building the strategies with that in mind. But what if your audience over the next few years is coming from the markets that have low ARPU? Right? How would that impact your design, user acquisition, or monetization strategies? And finally, the CEO of NVIDIA a few months ago, he talked about how we can expect very soon to have NPCs in our games powered by AI, and how fascinating that will be. Right? Non-scripted dialogue with NPCs, full immersion. It is fascinating, right? But what about AI-powered regular players? Right? What if you're running a multiplayer game and then suddenly you have these AI-powered players, which is not detectable by the current detection of the cheating, completely ruining the experience. Your matchmaking, your economy, all of that. What do you do now to avoid this scenario affecting you? So these are just like 4 examples. And what they all have in common is I came up with them in 30 minutes. So like this, right? And these are all the things that are very tangible right now. Some of them have already happened. So we're not talking about thinking of the unthinkable. This is the stuff that is heading our way or is already around us. And remember, the purpose of scenario planning is to think of the unthinkable, to start getting ready for the unknown, because this is already, we should already be dealing with these things. Right? So, my time is up. Hopefully I addressed the 2 objectives, and that is, to discuss the shortcomings of the traditional planning, and again, to get you familiar with the scenario planning. I think it's a fascinating topic, and there's a lot to be learned, and you benefited from doing this. For those of you who are interested about the next steps, I suggest you pick up a book. This is a good one. I read like 5, 6. There's also a lot of resources available online on this topic. But this one is super easy to get into. And then if you feel you want to learn more, there's like, other things that are available. You can also get this presentation by scanning the QR code. You can get in touch with me or if you want to chat more. And obviously, I'm happy to have a chat with you after this talk. Thank you. We might have enough time for one question, if anybody has a question.
I do actually.
Okay, sure.
You talked about the scenarios you mentioned, the challenges you listed as examples, right? These were all challenges one could foresee. They combine things that happen right now: AI, cheating, regulatory shifts. But to speak about foresee the unforeseen, and I would really foresee the unforeseen, but it's unlike scenarios, right? But if I just look at what's happening right now, I got a very limited view. So where's the sweet spot?
Sure. Well, if you remember this, right? So this process guides you,
Yeah.
right, through basically doing precisely what you just asked. You know, how to go about identifying the driving forces, right, that could impact your business landscape or whatever is the challenge that you're framing. You know, whether that's regulation, whether that's like AI, or whatever else it is, right? And so, with the help of this process, it guides you to basically open your mind to all the different opportunities, right? And then through the filtering and narrowing down, you come up with basically scenarios that are most plausible to happen or potentially the most impact for your business. And then you deal with that in whatever way basically you can. One of the biggest benefits of doing this is that it gives you like a first mover advantage. Right? So if you think about certain scenarios and you come up basically, with signals that you should be looking out for, then you can be monitoring the market for those signals, and if you see them coming up, then you can start reacting much sooner than the competitors.
Thank you.
Sure. Maybe one more question?
Yeah, looks like this is not your QR code, this is wrong code.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
It's mine, but send me an email and then I can share the presentation. It was online before. Maybe my team did something on the website.
I saw Bozo behind it. So head of ad monetization.
Oh, okay. Strange. Maybe they replaced the QR code. All right. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hope it was useful.